Let me tell you who is on my panel. On my left is Catherine West, who's Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific and MP for Hornsey and Wood Green. Next to her is Lord Harrington, Richard Harrington, Conservative peer, former Refugees Minister. On my right, Christina McAnea, who's General Secretary of the union UNISON, Britain's biggest trade union. And next to her is Dan Hodges, columnist for The Mail on Sunday. So 0345 6060 973, that is the number you need. You could phone in about the Bank of England's chief economist saying the British public needs to accept it's now poorer and not ask for higher wages and higher prices for their products. Britons in Sudan have been told to make their own way to an airfield north of the capital, Khartoum, as we've just heard from Ben Wallace there. The Foreign Secretary says we should be more constructive and less hostile towards China. He's making a big speech at the Mansion House this evening. And President Biden has confirmed he's running for a second term, which would end when he's 86 years old. Am I being sexist by even mentioning that? You tell me. You might want to ask about that. 034. Did I say sexist? I meant ageist. It's all going terribly well, but it's too early to say.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Right, welcome to our panel. Let's go to our first question. It's a text question from Brian in Carmarthen. Were you reassured by what you just heard from Ben Wallace about the Sudan evacuation? You're all in a very small space out there, sort of COVID-tastic space, sort of listening to Ben. Christina, let's start with you.
Well, it feels a bit more like they're kind of getting their act together at the moment, but you can't help but compare what happened in Afghanistan as well, which was, it felt like the British government were very slow in getting off the mark to get in there and actually support British subjects who are facing this. And I suppose when you read about what some of the other countries have done and the speed of their response, it doesn't show us in a very good light, I don't think. And a bit of me also thinks we have fantastic armed forces personnel in this country. You know, we have one of the best, probably the best in the world, I would think, and I would imagine that they must be getting diplomatic information about things that are happening to the government, and you'd think there would have been some sort of plan put in place.
Well, one thing
something being done about actually preparing for this. I
didn't have time to put to Ben, which I wish I now had, was I think yet again there is tension between the Foreign Office and the MOD. The MOD are ready to go at any point, but shall we say the Foreign Office hadn't quite got their ducks in a row. Yeah, that's as I understand it.
Don't they do like scenario planning, you know, like emergency disaster planning that you get here? You know, the NHS are always doing disaster planning and, you know, what they'll do in an emergency. And you would think, surely they do that for these countries that are pretty unstable.
Dan Hodges.
Well, I didn't need to be reassured because, contrary to that, I mean, I haven't understood this whole narrative about we've been getting it wrong. I think we've got it absolutely right. I mean, we did the first thing, which was evacuate British diplomats who were the most at-risk British citizens in the country, because in any scenario like this, they're the people who everybody knows where they're sitting. They're the people who are going to be targeted.
And the embassy was in the middle of the firing.
The embassy is in the middle of in the firing line. And the second thing, we did the absolutely right thing again, which is we waited. We didn't rush in as maybe say France and other countries did. We waited for the ceasefire to be negotiated. We've now got this 3-day window. It is much, much safer in that scenario to evacuate our people in that way. You know, we've had a lot of armchair generals saying, why aren't we doing this, why aren't we doing that? We were doing things, but we obviously, ministers were very aware of the negotiations that were taking place over the ceasefire. It was absolutely right that was done in a way outside of the glare of sort of publicity. You can't just send James Bond in there and start evacuating people out from a country in that way.
But the French and Germans did.
Well, no, the French. Well, the Germans are still there at the moment, securing the airfield, is my understanding. The French took a gamble, and the French, when they were organising their relief convoys, their convoys were attacked. A French national was injured, and that was a very, very dangerous way of doing it. The question is, do you want to try and evacuate people whilst the civil war is raging, or do you want to try and negotiate a ceasefire, which has been done, and then try and evacuate people within a 3-day window where it's much safer, which is what the government and other nations have done. And I think let's wait until the end of this before we start criticising. I mean, the one thing I would pick up on is, from what we're seeing at the moment, obviously there's still a long way to go. This evacuation seems to be being managed in a much more efficient and effective way than we saw in Afghanistan.
And it is a very different scenario, isn't it? Because in Afghanistan, the Taliban gave permission for people to leave. Here, there's a ceasefire at the moment, so one hopes that might last a bit longer than 3 days, but it is a very different situation. Now, Richard Harrington, you've been in the middle of this before when you became Refugees Minister, because there was all sorts of chaos at the heart of the government of the Ukrainian refugee programme. Do you think that people tend to rush to judgment too much on this and sort of automatically assume British incompetence?
Yes, I think the media enjoy that. The armchair critics that Dan referred to enjoy the armchair generals, he said. The reality is, as Dan said, we've just got to wait. In a week's time, then maybe people can pass judgment. But we don't know what's going on the ground. I don't buy this Foreign Office bickering with the Ministry of Defence and things.
Well, they often do, to be fair.
Well, all I can say is I don't know about those two departments because I've not experienced it in. But as you know, I've been involved with 2 or 3 different departments in one go in the Ukrainian stuff, and I did not find that to be the case. But anyway, let's see if perhaps whoever's on here next week, I probably won't be asked back again, but you never know.
Always asked back, Richard, but you haven't been back since.
Well, I'm still recovering from the last time, that's why.
We might come on to that later.
I'm still having therapy for that. But I think we have to wait, and it could be that they've screwed it up. I don't think so, because we don't know really what's gone on and what's going on there. We don't really know what their plans are. And Ben, in his job, he's very discreet in what he says, but it could be that they have really screwed it up. I don't think so, and I don't believe this. They've been caught unawares and don't have plans. But let's see.
Catherine West, you're a Shadow Foreign Office Minister. This is not your area. We should tell our listeners. But do you get confidential briefings from the Foreign Office or the MOD? Sort of, do they keep you up to date with what's going on?
I'm sure they'll be giving briefings to John Healy, who is Ben's opposite number. But I think one step is better than the last time we were in this situation. Do you remember that Dominic Raab was on a sun lounger down in Crete?
Who could forget that vision that we all think about
Ben
from
was
time
here.
to time?
He looks as though he's taking responsibility. He's in charge of it. There was a really nice tweet which I liked today from one of the staff members who said, "I've been up since 6, coordinating things from London." It does feel as though there are people, and hats off to those civil servants who are up that early in the morning trying to coordinate and talk to people down in Khartoum and reassure them. But the government does need to work round the clock to get this fixed. If you're asking me next Monday if this has been sorted or not, and it hasn't, then I'll be concerned. But I think the judgment's out a little bit in that we do have to give them a little bit of time.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people concerned here, aren't there? Like, in theory, 4,000. I think 2,000 have asked for permits to either go to the airfield or to the port. But I mean, that's quite a lot. I mean, that's probably 10 flights. Let me just take this follow-up question from Nikki in Kent on Alexa. She says, is it fair that the British ambassador to Sudan is working from home in southwest London, while thousands of Brits are stuck out there, and the EU's ambassador there says they won't leave till all EU citizens are safely rescued? Well, he did have the misfortune to be on holiday, I mean, on his annual leave when all this started. And he says, given that all of the diplomats have been taken out, I mean, it would be ridiculous for him to go back. He's apparently working 20-hour days, but I suppose the optics of this don't look good, Dan, because he sort of comes out of his home in Wimbledon and sort of gives an impromptu press conference to journalists on the street, and people think, well, you should be there.
Yeah, I'm less worried about the optics of this. I understand the optics. What I would be slightly concerned about is what it says about our intelligence gathering in theatre. If the ambassador felt, I mean, I don't know when he went on holiday. If the ambassador,
over Easter.
Yeah, I mean,
but he hadn't been back since Christmas, so he hadn't seen his family since Christmas. So I mean, I think if you're on annual leave, you can't really use that.
I completely understand that, and I'm not berating him at all. But what I'm just saying is, I don't know what point he left the country. But what is quite clear is that whatever point he left the country, he felt able to leave the country. So whatever our intelligence was in theatre about the nature of the situation in the country, I mean, I can't believe he would have left the country if he'd thought this situation was about to blow up, or even thought there was a potential of this situation blowing up. So I think where I would say there's legitimate criticism, there does seem to be a little legitimate criticism of an intelligence failure in this instance. If the ambassador, left the country and suddenly it blew up and he wasn't aware that this was potentially brewing, but I think. I do think in broader terms, the sort of broader criticism of, why isn't he back? Why isn't he in there? No, I mean, you do not want to send the ambassador back into this scenario when you've just evacuated people from there. That would obviously be ridiculous. So I think I don't accept that criticism. But as I said, I would be asking some questions about the intelligence that we have in the area.
Anybody else want to come in on that basis?
I think it's really positive that this time round the Border Force have been involved, because I know that with the Afghanistan situation, lots of people sort of piled onto flights and came back. And then there were lots of questions that were unanswered on arrival in London. I had a volunteer doctor from my constituency who went out to help and felt it was quite sort of chaotic. So I think it's good that the public servants have all worked together to have this sort of plan. So that hopefully also that will help with resettlement when people do come back.
Now, can I clear something up? Because just because Christina McAnea has a Scottish accent does not mean that she's the SNP representative on our panel tonight. She is most I'm putting words into your mouth, but I'm assuming that you're not.
I'm certainly not, and I haven't lived in Scotland for over 30 years. I'm Scottish and proud to be Scottish, but I've lived in London for over 30 years.
Well, you've kept the accent very well, if I may say so. I thought I'd just better clear that up in case our texter was not the only one that was thinking that. Right, more questions to come. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to our panel. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
18 minutes past 8. If you've only just tuned in, we have Christina McAnea, who's most emphatically not an SNP spokesperson on this panel. She's General Secretary of UNISON, Britain's biggest trade union. Lord Richard Harrington, I get told off when I put a Christian name in front of the peer's name, but that's what we know him as, Richard. He's Conservative peer and former Refugees Minister. Catherine West is Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia and the Pacific and MP for Hornsey and Wood Green. Now, you've just given me something to put in my pocket here, which I don't know if people who are watching can see, if we can do a close-up or not. What is it and why?
That is a sprig of rosemary, because today is Anzac Day, and it's Australia and New Zealand's one of their national days, and we did a wreath laying. Actually, Ben and James Cleverly were there, and myself as Shadow Minister, and sang all three anthems, very badly in my case.
Do you sort of slightly resent having to sing the New Zealand?
Well, exactly, but no, it was fine. It was fine. Just don't mention the All Blacks,
That was
all
not
right?
diplomatic. No. You mean the black and tan?
Very good at their rugby. But no.
But what is Anzac Day?
So it's obviously the memorial of the Gallipoli, which was the important
I do know. I
battle,
just thought I'd ask for people who don't.
which is obviously very important for Australians around national identity. Lots of young Australians went off, and my great uncle died actually near Passchendaele, and so when I go, if I've taken the children there and so on.
So did mine,
quite
actually.
A lot, really?
Yeah. I went to visit his grave a few years ago. It's quite an emotional thing.
It is, it is. And actually, I think the way that the Commonwealth War graves have all been kept.
Amazing.
And it's actually, something which I think is really fascinating. And the particular museum around that Popperinga, Passchendaele area has got really wonderful displays for schools.
But Christina hasn't lost her Scottish accent. You haven't lost your Australian accent, but it's not quite very pronounced, is it?
Do you think I'm an extra from Neighbours?
No,
That's the big
I would
question.
never, ever put you into that category, but I'm now trying to think which character you might have played in Neighbours.
Have you had any Kylie wine yet? That's the question.
No, I haven't actually. No. Anyway, should we get on with the programme? Dan Hodges is here from the Mail on Sunday. Right, let's go to Christopher in St Athan in South Wales. I was in Cardiff on Saturday, Christopher, one of my favourite cities in the UK. What would you like to ask?
My question is this. Is blaming civil servants the last refuge of the political scoundrel?
This is obviously a reference to Dominic Raab. Richard Harrington, now you've been a minister in various departments. Now, you mentioned the last time you came on this programme when you told me that the whole thing of stopping the boats was complete fiction and that you had never heard anything about it. And then, of course, it happened a week later that there was some sort of initiative announced. And did you sort of have a little go at your civil servants for not briefing you properly on that?
It was Rwanda I'd not heard about.
Rwanda, sorry,
Yes,
you're absolutely right.
And I hadn't heard about it, Iain. Pity I wasn't on the week after, otherwise I could tell you I'd heard about it. No, I don't blame the civil servants, and the reason for it is not to make excuses for the system generally, but I was, my sole job at that stage was the Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah.
I'd had the job for a couple of weeks. I deliberately asked not to be involved in the general Home Office stuff because I had a big job on my hand. We had tens of thousands of people that wanted to come over here, no visa system, no idea where to put them. I'm not making excuses to myself. I did not want to get involved in all the other stuff. Remember, I was put in to do that job. I wasn't elected at that stage. I had 9 very enjoyable years as an elected politician and 4 as a government minister, but it was a project to do that job. And I'm not one to wimp out of questions generally, but I just felt in that circumstance it was it's not that I didn't want to know because of that subject. There were tons of stuff. Like, for example, I never read lines to take, and I didn't do general interviews about what you think of economic policy and this policy and that policy. So that was my get out. And the amazing thing was, it happened to be true. I didn't know anything about it.
But you should have done. I mean, frankly, you should, shouldn't you?
Well, it was nothing to do with Ukrainian refugees.
But it was to do with refugees, and you were the refugees minister.
No, I was not the refugee minister. I was there for the Ukrainian refugee programme.
Okay.
If I was, it would have been slap bang in the middle of my portfolio.
Okay, let's get on to Dominic Raab. Is blaming civil servants the last refuge of the political scoundrel?
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Well, I'll say I think there's a lot of other last refugees of political scoundrels, but I don't believe in blaming civil servants. I think that ministers take responsibility for everything that goes on, like in a business if you're the CEO. There's ample ways when you're in government, and if you don't think the civil servants are up to it or doing a proper job, there's ample ways. You don't have the power to sack them, but if you have a word with the perm sec, say, look, it's just not working, they really do take action on that. So I do not know how anyone can be in a position where they're accused of bullying civil servants. If they did, I think it's very wrong. And that would be what a scoundrel does, because that's what people in a business do that can't, shouting at people, all this kind of stuff. It's totally unnecessary, and I don't think anyone should make any excuses for it. And I've not found this about civil servants being snowflakes and complaining about everything, if they don't like it. And, for example, I've seen Michael Gove, who I worked for when I did the refugee programme. Michael, with civil servants, he never raised his voice. He's a very polite man. But you got forensic, including me, you got forensically taken to pieces by a guy who'd done all his homework and questioned you one after the other.
That's Dominic Raab's defence. He says that's what he was doing.
But I've seen it not Dominic, but I've seen it in close quarters with plenty of people. And none of us, including me as a junior minister under Michael, could ever say we were bullied. But yes, you did leave after an hour feeling that you'd been in a ring with a heavyweight, because I just don't buy all this bullying stuff. And there's no excuse for it in the workplace, or if you're an MP, if you're a minister, it's the same. It's because if there's a power imbalance, somebody's taking advantage of it. And I don't think there's any need for it. And I would agree with your caller's thing about, that it's the last refuge of a scoundrel.
Catherine?
I think, was it 25 complaints?
24, let's not exaggerate. But he was only found guilty of 2 of them.
Yeah. And if you do read the report from the Foreign Affairs Select Committee after Afghanistan, there's absolutely no doubt that he was sort of shouting from his sofa bed, maybe his lounge in Crete, and the poor old civil servants, some of whom were young interns because it was the middle of August, were feeling utterly overwhelmed.
But
and
one of the
then
ones...
that just seems to have happened everywhere. Ministry of Justice.
One of the ones he was found guilty of, I think, was the Gibraltar one, where a sort of senior civil servant went against instructions and started negotiating away things that he had no authority to negotiate away. Now, I was trying to put myself in Dominic Raab's position there, and I would have been furious, and I would have felt justified in expressing that fury.
I think there are always situations where there's frustration, particularly in these delicate sort of situations. But that doesn't mean that you can be nasty and a bully to another person. And also, you do have to, as Richard said, take responsibility, because you're the politician. It's down to you. You're the front person. And also, there's all sorts of ways.
Gone directly against instructions and their mandate.
There are ways of dealing. Why can't you speak to number 10 and say, we're having an issue, we need somebody to come and sort this out?
He's a Foreign Secretary. Why should he have to do that? He's the second or third most important person in the government.
But there are always ways of resolving conflict. Attacking another person sort of with words, or throwing mobile phones, which I heard somebody else did actually at one point.
Yes, let's not mention that.
And all that sort of thing. It's not on, and I think it's really important that we maintain civil relations, even when mistakes perhaps have been made.
Gordon says, could Michael Gove have threatened to start dancing if he didn't get what he wanted? It would be enough for me to do whatever he was asking for. You're a pushover, Gordon. Christina, this is obviously relatively common in workplaces all over the country. Is this something that comes across your desk quite a lot?
Yeah, look, bullying and harassment is sadly increasing in workplaces. Perhaps it's just that people feel a bit more able to report it. So yeah, there is an increase in that. And I think this kind of trying to turn it into a bit of a culture war, where you call people snowflakes, or you call them the blob, or any of these other, trying to pretend it's some kind of conspiracy of trade union activists at senior level, which has kind of been implied, I think is really quite awful when we do have an independent civil service who see their job very much as speaking truth to power, and they're meant to be sort of going back and saying, I don't think you've got this right, Minister. And the Minister doesn't have to take their advice. And the example you've just given, Iain, of someone going directly against what they were told to do, then there's a process within any organisation if somebody does that you deal with. So you can discipline people, you can take them through competency procedures. I don't want to I don't know the details of that particular case, but all workplaces will have that, and the civil service absolutely has that in place. There are ways to deal with it.
But it seems that ministers are supposed to only go through the permanent secretary, and that they're not allowed to sort of have these kind of conversations with staff who most of us probably think they actually do directly work for the ministers, but it seems that they don't.
Well, the other way to look at it too is if you're a senior civil servant and you want to make a complaint about the minister, that has to be approved by the Prime Minister. And, you know, that can be a bit of a barrier for people who then think, do I want to actually make this complaint? What's it going to do to my career going forward? So I suspect there's quite a lot of things that aren't dealt with. Can I just say I wanted to agree with Richard? And when I was UNISON's head of the education team when we were negotiating on education, and I did meet with Michael Gove several times, and in fact quite often, and he's very robust, I would say, but very polite. And you came out kind of feeling, well, when you went in, you had to be well prepared and you had to know what you were talking about. Otherwise, you left feeling that didn't go too well. But he was never rude. I never saw him being rude. He was certainly never rude to me or to any of my other trade union colleagues. And he's a very clever, bright, intelligent man, and probably doesn't feel he needs to be rude to do this. But I just think this kind of let's just blame the civil servants. It's an easy thing to start thinking it's a conspiracy.
Dan Hodges.
Well, look, I mean, on Dom Rob, I mean, I wrote about this at the weekend. Dom Rob was an idiot. I mean, Dom Rob was warned by his permanent secretary at the Foreign Office about his behaviour. He was warned by his permanent secretary at Justice, and he ignored them. He did bully someone. That was quite clear in the report. He had said that if he was found guilty of bullying, he would resign, and it was right that he resigned. But there is a more fundamental thing that I think has been overlooked in the report, which is we talk about this blob, we talk about conspiracies. The report was very clear. It said that there was a anonymous, unofficial, informal group of civil servants who got together collectively to submit a complaint against Dominic Raab, initially unofficially. A number of them had never even met Don Raab or served under Don Raab. The report itself said that complaint was the most significant complaint because it led to the other complaints that ultimately led to his dismissal. Catherine said, I think, how many said 24 of those complaints were submitted. Only 2 of them were upheld. None of the complaints that were submitted by that, I can't remember what it was. It was it was described as the MOJ group complaint, I think it was called, were upheld. So we've got a situation where the practical reality is there was this unofficial group of civil servants who got together, have had a cabinet minister dismissed, and none of their complaints were upheld. Now, that is concerning. You can't ignore that. That is problematic, and it's not just a party political point. I mean, Catherine, you've been saying that. I mean, I suspect you're going to be in government in 18 months. You're going to have an agenda. Some of it the civil service, senior civil servants will agree with junior civil servants will agree with, and some of it they won't. That's the nature of this. And I think it's absolutely right. We shouldn't, ministers have to take responsibility. But if we want to have a mature discussion about the governance of this country, we cannot ignore the fact that there is a cultural agenda that the civil service puts forward and propagates. I mean, I remember Jonathan Powell, very well-respected Chief of Staff for Tony Blair. I mean, he was asked about this a couple of years ago, and he said the British civil service is like a monastic order in terms of when you're trying to propagate the sort of the elected will of the people. So this can't be a party political thing, but I do think if we have this thing where, well, ministers are the bad guys and the civil servants are the good guys, I think we're being a little bit naive.
Can I quickly come in? Just very quick.
Can we just leave it till after the news? And I'll let you both come back for a brief second because we're running rather late. It's 8:33. News headlines on LBC with Josh Bancroft.
The Defence Secretary has told LBC efforts to get British nationals out of Sudan will continue for as long as it is safe to do so. A military airfield is being used to fly people out. The first flight landed in Cyprus this evening. A stepfather will spend at least 28 years in prison for the murder of his 2-year-old stepdaughter. Lola James was killed at her home in Pembrokeshire in July 2020. And the civil rights activist and singer Harry Belafonte has died at the age of 96. As a campaigner, he worked closely with Martin Luther King and later became a confidant of Nelson Mandela. LBC weather: isolated showers moving into the far north tonight. Clear spells elsewhere with some light rain in the southwest, a low of -4.
This is LBC.
Christina, McAnea, Richard Harrington, Catherine West and Dan Hodges taking your calls. Catherine and Richard have forgone their opportunity to comment more on the last question because we want to move on. Let's go to a text question from Tom in Norwich. I'm a junior doctor who's been working for over a decade as a doctor. I'm about to go to work in a specialist hospital which takes referrals from all over East Anglia, and I'm the only doctor with my speciality in the hospital. I've had a 2% pay rise per year for the last 4 years. Also, my wife is a nurse. What do you think I'm worth per hour, and why would anyone work in public services apart from for the claps? Well, that's quite pointed, isn't it, Dan?
I've got no idea. I'm not going to speculate. I mean, I think in terms of the broader issue, though, I'm going to be completely honest. I've had a lot of broadly have a lot of sympathy with public sector workers who have been going out on strike recently. I've got a lot of sympathy with the unions who have been representing them. That's unions' jobs. I don't think it's realistic to say to public sector workers you should voluntarily bear the burden of obviously the explosion in inflation, which is not their fault. I've got to be honest, I have got less sympathy with the junior doctors than I have of any of the people who have been going out on strike, for the simple reason, what are junior doctors currently what's their opening bid? I mean, do you remember what their bid is? Is it
35%?
35%. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's completely unrealistic. I think it's insulting to other public sector workers, frankly, who have not demanded anything like that. I see where, there's currently a debate going on, criticism of the government about whether or not the strike is even legal.
That's the nurses' strike. That's not.
Well, it's not the junior doctors. My apologies. But I mean, I just and frankly, I don't know what the junior doctors are thinking of, demanding something which is a demand which is obviously so ludicrous that they must know no government minister, and even the Labour Party, I think, haven't they? I think even Wes Streeting's come out and said that's not a realistic demand. So I'm sorry, I'm not going to sort of settle on a figure, but it's certainly not 35%.
Christina, do you have junior doctors as members?
We don't know.
I mean, you've obviously been a leading player in the nurses' dispute, and you recommended to your members that they should settle, and they voted to do so, unlike the Royal College of Nursing. Let's start on the junior doctors, though. I mean, do you take Dan's point about, I mean, obviously as a negotiator, you always go in above what you think you're going to get, but it does seem to be rather high, to put it mildly.
Yeah, but to be honest, I'm not sure. Every union is a democratic organisation, and it will be their members who decide what the figure is they want to put it on. Now, in my union, when we started this process back in sort of July, August, when we had the peer review body award of £1,400 flat rate, we did not put a figure on what we were asking for. We just wanted something that would help address inflation. And we started, and the government wouldn't talk to us. We went through all of that. Eventually we took strike action. They did talk to us. But every union has their own tactics they will follow. And those tactics are set by their members, if you like, their senior people who sit in committees who will say this is what it is. I do have a lot of sympathy for the junior doctors. I think they do an amazing job. They basically, if you go to A&E or any of these places, you'll be seeing junior doctors who have been working really long hours probably, who are exhausted, who are expected to turn up, day in and day out, almost regardless of whether even when they're unwell, they turn up. So I do have a lot of sympathy for them, but a lot of it is about the working practices that they've got. And actually, I think something that addressed not just the pay issue, but the whole working practices for junior doctors and others.
And also, maybe not calling them junior doctors, because, I mean, maybe in the first 3 years you can say, well, they're junior, but you've got junior doctors who are like in their 50s.
Well, it's everybody up until a consultant is considered a junior doctor, and I think a lot of people don't realise that.
Give people a bit of professional pride. I know it doesn't mean anything really, but I'd have thought that was something that...
But can I just say, we have to be honest, whatever we call them, we're not going to be able to afford a 35% pay increase, are we? So,
unions,
or anything even remotely close to a 35%.
But like most unions, people start off with, as you said, an opening bid, and then you end up.
There are opening bids and there are opening bids. I mean, 35%.
I accept that, but you want to get into negotiations, and they want to make their case about why they think this is important, and some of it is about catch up. And we've had below inflation increases now for over 10 years, and the big issue, of course, in the NHS is the vacancies. We've got 130,000 vacancies in the NHS. Many of them are doctors. We just can't get people. It doesn't seem like an attractive profession to get into.
Because you're here, can I just ask you quickly about the nurses? Because your union's settled, but the Royal College of Nursing hasn't. You've got Unite, I think, is that their results coming out this week.
Yeah.
If they decide not to settle as well, where does that leave your union? I mean, do you then say, well, actually, we said we'll settle, but we're not going to now?
No. So all of us, we're including the RCN. I mean, me and Pat Cullen were saying pretty much the same thing, which was we were encouraging our members to accept the offer. We all went out with a recommendation to accept. And UNISON members picked it. We got 74% voted to accept it. RCN, I think, got 53% to reject. But we are where we are. They've decided to reject it. They've decided to try and take further industrial action. But even the RCN are saying they don't want the offer taken off the table. They want it to stay there. And I have to say, we had our health conference last week in Bournemouth, and I went down to speak to them, and people there were very clear. It's not that it's the best offer in the world, but actually we did push the government into sitting down with us to finding additional money that will actually make a difference to people. They'll feel this in their pockets. And we negotiated in good faith. We went out to recommend in good faith. We got a vote to accept, and we expect the government to hold by that deal.
Well, I'm sure they will, but they're not. Now you've accepted, they're certainly not going to offer more money to the other unions, because then they'd have to offer it to your members too. And then the other unions will say, well, look, UNISON, they voted for it. Why don't UNISON members come and join us, because we've got you a better deal?
Well, that is what some of them are saying at the moment.
Is it?
But
Right.
that's a tactic
I'm glad
trade
I'm so
unions use all the
perceptive.
time.
I've got to just say, I mean, this is one of the problems with the whole 35% camp, because you have union leaders who are trying to actually do the best for their members in a practical and pragmatic way, and then suddenly, obviously, people are saying, well, hang on a second, you've settled for this, but these guys are fighting for 35%.
Catherine?
In the end, they've just got to get back around the table, because that's the only way it's going to get resolved. And my issue with the way that it's been handled is this dates back to last spring, so it's been going a year, and they've actually normalised striking in the NHS, because they've failed to get round the table. And I think that's really problematic, because that should be the last resort. And this, I don't want to talk over Christina, because this is her expertise, but, when I ran a council, if somebody told me in the service that there was a problem, I'd get them in straight away. Say, what do you want? What is it? Have a bit of a Barney, show that I listened, because I cared.
In a non-bullying, polite,
Exactly.
and respectful way, obviously.
And we anything to avoid unhappiness, have a happy workplace. Why is that so hard? But what they did was they thought, if we just ignore it, it'll go away. They stuck their fingers in their ears. This is not going away because it's economics. 10% inflation still. They kept hoping inflation was going down. It's not. And so it just means that, public sector workers cannot put food on the table. Nurses going to food banks.
Richard?
Yeah, I think that's a little unfair, Catherine. I mean, it's our job to disagree with each other, and I try not to. Because it's not, when you say that they just ignored the pay demand, I mean, there was a proper procedure. There was the independent commission, and then Christina's shaking her head at me, and no doubt she'll come back, because this is her area of expertise, you said. I'm just saying my take on it. And they do negotiate with management. Now, whether it would make a difference if the Secretary of State for Health got involved from day one or not, I don't know. But they can't get involved all the time with all this sort of thing. There's a proper machinery and procedure to do it. But I would make a point on the junior doctors, Iain. There are other professions like barristers. Junior barristers are from the day they qualify until they become a King's Counsel. There are things like that. But there's no question about it. They work hard. The hours are better than they used to be. I'm read, but they're still more than most people's hours. But the thing is, they get incremental pay rises all the time. In that rise up from being a junior doctor who's just qualified.
Pensions, which the rest of us can only dream of.
Exactly. So it isn't just simply that question. And I think as Dan's pointed out, they made it very difficult for anyone to negotiate with them, because it's the government's job as well to make sure inflation's kept under control. And whilst wages are not the only reason, I'm not saying they are the only reason, you can't have very high runaway wage increases. When I was a kid, in the 70s, it happened all the time. Inflation was 20, 30%. It was frightening. And of course,
that was a different kind of inflation, though, to be fair. In that wage rises now, I don't think necessarily fuel inflation in the way that they certainly did in the 1970s.
Well, that's fair, but they're part of it.
But I note that none of you has answered Tom's question, which was, what do you think I'm worth per hour? But Abby in London on a text has answered the question. She says, any doctor is worth more than an MP.
Can I just come back on
Very quickly.
Richard's point on the process? What we have is a peer review body that the government hid behind, and it's a peer review body appointed by the government. They set a remit for them. They basically give them directions and put a limit on how much they can say they're prepared to offer, or they're prepared to award. And so it's not an independent system. It's really not. And it wasn't that we told them from last July that this wasn't acceptable and that something had to be done, and they consistently hid behind the peer review body, and it took strike action before they would actually sit down with us. Now, they could have started talking to us in October, November, brought all the unions in, had a discussion with us, and quite frankly, hopefully would have avoided any strike.
If you don't agree,
if only Matt Hancock was still Health Secretary, he said no one ever. Right, Tom, thank you very much for that. I'm sorry you didn't quite get the answer that you were looking for there. We'll take another question in just a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC.
$8.51. We have a cracking, fun question for the end, so don't go anywhere. You'll want to hear their responses to this one. But first, we have a text question from Will in Crediton. Is James Cleverly right that the UK needs a constructive relationship with China to tackle global issues such as climate change, or does the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims and their actions surrounding Taiwan warrant a firmer stance? Well, James Cleverly is making his annual foreign policy speech to the Mansion House this evening, and it's only about China, which is quite unusual. Richard Harrington.
Iain, it's such a difficult question, isn't it? The government moved between security and human rights to the realities of business. And the fact is, China has to be one of our big business partners. It's impossible to run the world as it is without a close relationship with China. And we have to accept the fact that in foreign policy, whatever we all might think, we do not select countries because of their human rights. If that was the case, half the countries we wouldn't even deal with. I wish it wasn't the case, but it is. So all we can do is use what influence we have with China as a trading partner with them to keep pushing and influencing as much as we can. But the reality is we can't ignore the fact that China is one of the biggest markets in the world and one of our biggest supplier of goods.
Weren't politicians making similar arguments in the 1930s about Germany?
Yes. And we went to war with Germany. And I hope we don't go to war with China. I mean, there's got to be limits, I agree. But let's face the realities of what it is today. I banged the table again and Iain's bullying me. And he's right to. I confess I needed bullying to tell me to stop banging the table. So I'm holding my hands together
Catherine,
under the
China.
table.
The 3 C's, Iain. Challenge, compete, cooperate. Challenge on human rights, on Hong Kong, the special arrangements there, which obviously we feel very strongly about. Compete because we need to keep up and we need to have the technological advances and we need to be doing our own thing, not just looking around and seeing what everyone else is doing. And cooperate on climate change, perhaps some of the health challenges, because there's a lot of research that's going on that hasn't got a defence application. But obviously national security will be a big concern in amongst those 3 C's.
So it sounds as if you're agreeing with James Cleverly there.
Well, I'm agreeing on cooperating on climate because I think they are the biggest emitter.
We're going to be talking about this after 9, so actually, no, we're not. We're talking about Joe Biden after 9. Ignore that. I'm going delirious. We were going to talk about it, but we decided to talk about Joe Biden instead. James Cleverly is essentially saying, look, we have to deal with the reality of the situation. China is there. It's a massive trading partner. We might want to sort of virtue signal all we like about genocide for the Uyghurs and all the rest of it. But in the end, we have to deal with these people. I mean, that's essentially what you're saying.
We can't pretend China doesn't exist, but that doesn't mean that we can't strengthen our position. Parliament at the moment has a stronger position on China than I think the government does. Yeah. And I think the government needs to come a bit closer to where we are, particularly around national security. I mean, we were talking about TikTok over a year ago, and they only came out with it last month. Other concerns that we've had around certain military cooperation, which we found out about, and you know, we have to have an audit. Labor wants to have an audit when we get in to see what exactly is, how integrated are we with various.
Well, you could maybe ask the Chinese about their attempts to try and bully LBC not to talk about Taiwan, for example.
Yes, well,
but that's another story.
The bullying of Taiwan, unfortunately, does go on.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what James Cleverly says. I mean, I'd be surprised if it was his speech was quite as it was represented in that tweet. I mean, I think what is quite clear is we, as a the government and as a nation, we have to adopt a much more robust attitude in response to China and all these what are effectively aggressor states. I mean, we had the example. You used the example of 1930s. We don't need to go back to 1930s. We can go back to the 1990s and the 2000s with our appeasement of Russia, and we can all see where that ended up. And obviously, at the moment, we're in the crisis in Ukraine. I hope I'm proved wrong, but all the analysts seem to be saying we're on the brink of a crisis in the next 3, 4, 5 years of a similar nature in relation to Taiwan. And if we do get into that crisis, that frankly will make what's happening in Ukraine look like something of a sideshow. So we definitely have to be more robust, because as we've seen, there is one lesson from history: is when you appease countries like this, when you appease dictatorships like this, it only ever ends up in the same place.
Christina.
Yeah, I mean, my worry is countries like China and I know they're that we have to have them as trading partners to an extent, but they have an appalling human rights record. And I don't think that's an exaggeration to say that. They have an appalling human rights record, but then so do many others, like Saudi Arabia. And, the King of Saudi Arabia is invited to, the Crown Prince, whatever he's called, is invited to probably come and meet the royal family, etc. So we do take a bit of we look both ways sometimes with these things. And
it's just realpolitik, isn't it?
I get that, but it would be good to sometimes, for the government, and I say this for any political government, I'm not actually just meaning this government, I mean any party that's in power, to take a tougher line with some of these countries. But I also agree, and maybe I would say this as a negotiator, that to try and change some of these, you do have to engage with them, and just pretending that that's not happening is not the answer. So I probably a bit, as Catherine was saying, about having to engage.
Right. Our fun question for the end from Iain in Southampton. It's a corker, this. Adele has joined James Corden for the last ever carpool karaoke. But if he decided to film one more of them with you, which song would you sing with him? And will you give us a blast of how it would sound? Who would like to start? Dan, you look really keen.
No, I'm sorry, Leanne. I'm not going to be singing it. But if it was me, I'll be honest. It would probably be things can only get better. We're a political show.
There you go.
I'll go back to my old Labour days. It's a classic song. It takes me back to a time when I thought the country would get a bit better. How wrong I was, but one lives in hope.
Christina.
So I was thinking, should I come up with some bright, clever answer? But actually, I'm from Glasgow, and we have a country and western valve that develops once you.
Oh my God!
40.
You're not going to do country and western, are you?
So mine would probably be, because I think it would be fun to do this with James Corden, would probably be Jolene.
Go on then.
Jolene, 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 Jolene. I'm stopping there because I'm going too high notes.
I think that's absolutely wonderful. Well done, Catherine.
I would have to go with my all-time favourite for any karaoke, which is "Don't worry about a thing, 'cause every little thing is gonna be all right." That's all you need to do. Then you repeat it, and you grab someone nice in the audience, and they come and sing it with you.
You've both set a very high bar for Richard.
Well, I heard Bob Marley perform that. Shows how old I am. Mine would be My Way, Frank Sinatra, and I'm not singing it.
Isn't it funny how the two blokes on the panel won't sing? But I'm just wondering if this might encourage Dan Hodges to sing.
It really won't, honestly. And your listeners will thank you. Will thank me for it.
Okay. Unfortunately, that was the 12-inch version, which wasn't the bit that I was hoping to play. But there we are. Thank you very much indeed to Dan Hodges, Christina McAnea, Catherine West, and Richard Harrington. We'll have another cross question for you tomorrow. My For the Many podcast partner, Jackie Smith, will be on the panel, so you can look forward to that. Now, in the next hour, we have another discussion to look forward to, because we're going to be talking about Joe Biden. He has launched his 2024 re-election campaign today, and it could be a remarkable election campaign, this, because it looks as if Donald Trump might well be his opponent yet again. Now, people are raising their eyebrows about this, saying, well, is it really right that somebody who will be 86 at the end of their second term should be running for a second term? Or is that just being ageist? Do we not understand that people in their 70s and 80s can actually perform just as well as people in their 40s, 50s and 60s? I have to say, I'm not sure I'd be up to running for president at the age of 82, but then I'm not going to, am I? Keen to hear your views.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock. The Defence Secretary has told LBC the operation to get thousands of British nationals out of Sudan will go on for as long as it safely can. The first plane landed in Cyprus earlier, with more to follow in the next few hours. The government response has been criticised for being too slow, but Ben Wallace has told Iain Dale they have to make sure rescue teams can work safely.
We put people at risk in order to rescue